Hello, I'm Jennifer, a 35-year-old woman who recently went through a divorce. The end of my marriage caught me off guard, as I once believed it to be the most fulfilling relationship of my life. However, as time went on, I realized that our union had cracks I couldn't ignore. Now, I'd like to share our journey, from how it all began. John and I met through a mutual friend, and our connection was instant. He was charming, attractive, and had a magnetic personality. We dated for 3 years before deciding to get married. Throughout our relationship, things seemed to flow smoothly. We shared common values and made an effort to accommodate each other's needs. But there was one significant hurdle: John's parents, Mary and Kevin. The first sign of trouble came early. When John took me to meet them, I was greeted by an awkward sight: 3 plates set at the dinner table, for John, Mary, and Kevin. There wasn't one for me. I felt humiliated, but I brushed it off and had to ask for a plate myself. Throughout the meal, they made cutting remarks and were dismissive, and John sat there, silent. Looking back, that moment was a warning of the larger issues that would plague our marriage. But I held on, hoping John would defend me. He didn't. After that uncomfortable evening, I waited for John to bring it up, to apologize, or at least acknowledge how wrong it all felt. But he didn't. Frustrated, I finally confronted him about it. I told him how disrespected I felt, and his reaction was shockingly indifferent. He brushed it off, saying he was tired and wanted to sleep. When I pushed further, expressing how hurt I was that he hadn't stood up for me, John defended himself, saying he couldn't possibly disrespect his parents in their own home. I felt a surge of anger. Disrespect them? I asked. You couldn't even ask them to be decent to me? A heads up would have been nice. My parents are different, he said, and speaking up would have been disrespectful. And you're still defending them? Do you even care how I felt in that moment? Can we talk about this later? I'm going to bed. Good night. I stood there, feeling a sharp sting of betrayal. It was clear he felt no remorse. I hoped maybe he was embarrassed and didn't know how to deal with it. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, John acted like nothing had happened. I was still angry, so I didn't speak to him for a week, waiting for him to apologize. That apology never came. I realized this wasn't a battle worth losing my marriage over. So, I buried my feelings, pushed aside the hurt, and resumed speaking to him. But things had changed. Without discussing it, we never went to Mary and Kevin's house again, and I avoided them as much as I could. The next time I saw them was at our wedding. I kept my distance, but eventually, they approached us to congratulate us. It wasn't long before they began discussing our honeymoon plans. When we mentioned Hawaii, they offered to pay for a trip to Paris instead, on the condition that they come with us. As tempting as it sounded, I wanted time alone with John, not a family trip. Feeling overwhelmed, I excused myself and headed to the bathroom, uneasy with the whole situation. Isn't a honeymoon supposed to be about creating special moments together? While Hawaii wasn't Paris, it was still a beautiful place I had always dreamed of visiting. What bothered me wasn't the destination, but the fact that John made the decision without even consulting me. I tried to shake off my disappointment and enjoy the reception, but the mood had already soured. I endured the rest of the evening and the quiet ride home in silence, too drained to even begin explaining how I felt. The unease lingered the next morning, and I decided to talk to John about it. I shared my concerns about the honeymoon, explaining that it wasn't about rejecting Paris, but about the fact that we hadn't made the decision together. I told him how important it was for us to plan something special just for us, but John brushed it off, emphasizing how generous his parents were in offering the trip and how Paris was an incredible opportunity. Frustrated, I tried again to explain that it wasn't about the destination, it was about the lack of communication between us. Despite my concerns, John dismissed them, insisting that I was overthinking it and ruining a wonderful chance. Feeling hurt and unsupported, I reluctantly agreed to go along with his parents' plan, though I buried my reservations. A month later, our vacation began. We met Mary and Kevin at the airport, and to my surprise, they were unusually friendly. I couldn't quite believe the shift in their behavior, so I remained guarded. During the first week in Italy, they kept up the friendliness, and I cautiously hoped things might be different. But slowly, they reverted to their old ways. They started making sarcastic comments about my clothes, questioning why I would wear certain outfits. Some days, they even excluded me from their plans, labeling my attire as too embarrassing for the places they wanted to go. As the weeks dragged on, I felt more and more isolated. With 3 more weeks of this trip ahead, I did my best to adapt, dressing more modestly and even earning compliments from locals, but nothing seemed to satisfy them. Mary and Kevin began taking John along on outings without telling me, leaving me alone at the hotel. Then came the passive-aggressive comments about my weight and eating habits. If I ordered anything other than a salad, Mary would make pointed remarks about it, all while indulging in heavier meals herself. Through it all, John sat quietly, sometimes even stifling laughter. I found myself counting down the days until we could return home. Spending time with John and his parents became unbearable. They relentlessly criticized and belittled me, and John simply stood by, ignoring it all. I knew I had to talk to him about it, but every time I tried to raise the issue, he dismissed my concerns or avoided the conversation entirely. On our last day, I took the initiative to gather our passports and tickets for the flight home. When I asked John where my ticket was, he shrugged and said he didn't have it. His response didn't sit right with me, but I was too mentally exhausted to make sense of the situation. I went to Mary and Kevin's room, hoping they had my ticket. When I asked Mary about our departure, she casually mentioned that she, Kevin, and John were leaving in 3 hours. I was stunned. What about my ticket? I asked. Oh, we forgot to buy one for you, Mary replied, as if it were no big deal. Shocked and upset, I pressed her on how they could forget something so important. Mary waved it off, telling me not to worry, they'd buy my ticket separately, but something about the whole situation didn't feel right. I vented my frustration to John about being pushed aside, insisting that he couldn't keep supporting his parents at my expense. When I sought help with the ticket situation, John's mother insisted I deal with it on my own, only intensifying the tension. John was caught between his loyalty to his parents and our relationship, leaving him without a clear path forward. In the end, he decided to go to Turkey with them, leaving me to find my own way home. The news hit me like a punch to the gut. As we left their room, I pleaded with John not to abandon me, but he turned away, visibly embarrassed. He explained that his parents had funded the trip from their retirement savings, and he felt he couldn't disrespect them. While I was appalled, I couldn't ignore how disrespectful his parents were being to me. Tears filled my eyes as I watched him pack, his gaze barely meeting mine, offering no apologies or even a suggestion to cover my ticket back. The urge to cause a scene was strong, but I felt too humiliated to act. When it was time to leave, John walked away with his head down, while Mary and Kevin waved goodbye with glee. I was left seething and alone in a foreign country. After enduring their remarks and John's silence for an entire month, I had reached my breaking point. Revenge suddenly seemed like a compelling necessity, and I knew exactly how to achieve it. I learned that John's financial stability had come at the cost of his parents' retirement. His mortgage was assumable, and they had transferred it to him when he became stable. Now, they were drowning in debt, and the house was on the brink of foreclosure. John nominated me as the next owner, citing my higher income and excellent credit. I called my best friend Nancy, whose husband Benjamin specialized in property law. During a FaceTime call, we mapped out a plan, detailing how I had been solely responsible for paying off the mortgage since John's nomination. Initially, I accepted his lack of contributions, thinking he deserved some financial comfort, but after 7 months of his neglect, I confronted him, only to be met with accusations of jealousy over his lifestyle. It was time to take control. Before the mortgage, I had my own life, and I should have seen the red flags about John's character. Talking to Benjamin opened my eyes to the absurdity of my situation. He expressed disbelief that I hadn't recognized John's true nature before marrying him. I admitted that I was blinded by love. Benjamin pointed out the insanity of John relying on me to pay off his home and advised me on the next steps. He assured me that transferring the house into my name would be straightforward. Given my payment history, he offered to handle the legalities, even preparing an eviction notice. Grateful for their support, I promised myself to be more vigilant in the future. Knowing John and his parents had a long layover in Turkey, I planned my move carefully. They intended to stay at an airport hotel in Istanbul, and while I had initially looked forward to the trip, I now saw it as an opportunity to serve them the eviction notice upon their return. I booked a flight home, lucky to find one departing in just a couple of hours. The journey was a blur of tears as I grappled with the reality of my life. Despite my love for John, he hadn't bothered to check on me. The thought of evicting them brought me a fleeting sense of satisfaction. I imagined their predicament, 3 adults crammed into our small apartment, which was about to lose its lease. But any sympathy quickly faded as I remembered how they had abandoned me without a thought for my return. If they could treat me that way, I had no regrets about taking decisive action. As soon as I landed, I set my revenge in motion, checking John and his parents' flight status. I saw they would be departing in 3 hours. Fueled by adrenaline, I drove straight to Mary and Kevin's house. Using the spare key hidden under the mat, I let myself in and woke them up. My next step was to find the best divorce lawyer nearby and initiate proceedings. I called Nancy, and she and Benjamin came over to support me as I signed the paperwork to remove John's name from ownership and finalized the eviction notice. Seeing my friends brought forth emotions I had buried since arriving home. It was hard to be back in a place filled with reminders of John, but their presence allowed me to release my pent-up feelings. After they left, I checked John's flight and saw they had about an hour before boarding. Wanting to appear composed, I took a brief nap, managing to rest for about 12 hours. When I woke, I quickly got ready and headed to the divorce attorney's office to collect the papers. Upon my return, I had just an hour before John and his parents were due back. My heart raced as their arrival drew near, but I steeled myself for what was to come. When they walked through the door, their surprise at finding me in their house was palpable. Ignoring their questions, I boldly declared my intention for them to leave. Their confusion quickly turned to alarm, with Mary and Kevin demanding an explanation. I calmly informed them that I wanted them out because the house was now mine, explaining that I had been paying the mortgage for the past year. John, clearly caught off guard, attempted to deflect blame, claiming they believed he was handling the payments. I countered his excuses, revealing that he had nominated me as the owner and exposing his deceit. The shock on their faces confirmed that my plan had worked, and I felt a surge of empowerment as I stood firm in reclaiming what was rightfully mine. I made it clear that John was excluded from the ownership due to his consistent failure to contribute, solidifying my claim on the house. I firmly requested that they vacate the premises. Ignoring their pleas and protests, I was resolute, warning them of police involvement if they refused to leave. Just before they departed, I handed John the divorce papers, expressing my unwillingness to stay with someone who had exploited me and failed to support me when I needed it most. Despite his desperate attempts to apologize and plead for another chance, the emotional damage was far too deep for reconciliation. Watching them leave filled me with a sense of satisfaction. Although I knew healing from the hurt and betrayal would take time, I had taken back control of my life. I refused to let John and his parents dictate my happiness. This was my ultimate victory. In the following months, John tried to contest the divorce but quickly backed down upon realizing the financial strain it would impose. The last I heard, they had sought refuge with relatives while trying to find a place they could afford. Mary and Kevin returned to work to support themselves. While it was disheartening to see them struggle, it served as a lesson for them about meddling with someone who had once offered a helping hand. Since parting ways with them, my life has blossomed with greater happiness. Occasionally, memories of their actions resurface, but I find solace in the satisfaction of having taken a stand and reclaimed my life.